Welcome to today's episode of the Normalized Surrogacy podcast by Surrogacy Mentor. I'm your host, Carrie Flamer Powell, experienced gestational surrogate, surrogacy agency founder, and owner of Surrogacy Mentor, where our aim is to help surrogates match with reputable surrogacy agencies for a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey. Today, I'm happy to welcome back our special guest, marriage and family therapist, Carole Lieber-Wilkins. Welcome, Carole.
Thank you, Carrie. Thanks for inviting me back.
Of course, always good to chat with you. So before we dive into our topic today, which is nightmare cases in mental health and surrogacy, I want to share a little bit about Carole. So as I mentioned, Carole is a licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice, licensed in California, Idaho, and Nevada. She provides individual and couples counseling as well as psychoeducational consultations for those moving into alternative paths to parenthood. Mostly, she's passionate about helping people create healthy families. Carole is also the co-creator of fertilityforms.com, which is 56 questionnaires used by mental health professionals who are working with donors, surrogates, and intended parents to provide the information to the mental health professional before they meet. A specialist in the field of reproductive medicine, adoption, and family building options since 1986, Carole became a founding member of Resolve of Greater Los Angeles in 1987 and served on the board of directors in various positions for many years. Carole is also the co-author of Let's Talk About Egg Donation, Real Stories from Real People. This is the first book of its kind written by two moms via egg donation that guides the reader through the process from diagnosis to parenthood through egg and embryo donation. So you have been in this industry for longer than most people I know. So you've seen it all.
Yeah, I'm getting to be senior. And it means I have had a lot of experiences, good, bad, and everything in between.
Yes. Well, really appreciate your wealth of knowledge on all things mental health, specifically in surrogacy. And so that's why we're here today is we're doing a series on nightmare cases in surrogacy with the intention of educating people on what to look for, what to avoid, what to hopefully learn from. And specifically, we are going to talk about the mental health portion of the surrogacy process. So before we get into the nightmare cases, why don't you just give us like the 2-minute or less overview of the role that mental health practitioners play in surrogacy?
Great. Yeah, so it's 2 or 3-fold. The participation of mental health professionals, which can be either psychologists, marriage and family therapists, or social workers. One of the roles they play, of course, is before a surrogate even gets accepted into a program or starts their journey is the actual psychological evaluation or assessment of that individual. That always includes a psychological instrument, sometimes called a test, but you can't pass or fail a test. Oftentimes the language is used, they didn't pass psych. There's actually no such thing as not passing psych. But that process is intended to give the mental health professional a lot of information about the candidate and their functioning and their relationships and their history with the sole intention to determine if they are a good candidate for their own well-being and the well-being of anyone that they might carry a child for. And it always includes the evaluation of their partner as well, because it's a family affair, right? It's not just the surrogate doing this. The other role a mental health professional plays, is to provide psychological support to the surrogate once she gets going in the journey. This is usually a monthly check-in of any duration up to about an hour to see how she's doing, how is the relationship going with intended parents, what kinds of issues might she be having, Is there something the mental health professional can do to assist in communication? Or has there been a change in her life, in her actual life,
Right.
that she might need support for or need coordination with the agency?
Mm-hmm.
And then the third one is the unfortunate one, and that is where there has not been ongoing psychological support, but the mental health professional is called in when pardon the expression, the you-know-what hits the fan.
Right.
And that is a very difficult situation to deal with, not only because it's a crisis at that time, but also because there's often no pre-existing relationship between the mental health professional and the surrogate. So you're kind of starting from scratch, trying to do crisis intervention or see how to support her through whatever is going on.
Sure. Okay. So, just in the decade or so that I've been in the industry, mental health's really come more to the forefront in the process. And it's not just a box to be checked off in the screening process. So I'm
Good.
really glad to see, I'm really glad to see that. And I think that as more cases have completed over the last decade, people have really seen firsthand the need for mental health support. So what you guys do is super important.
Yeah.
So,
And the first one of those that I mentioned, the assessment process, is often the step that, when it's done properly and correctly, can avoid some of the nightmares that we may be talking about. Not always, for sure, but oftentimes there are things that could be caught at the outset that might have prevented the problem later.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and dig in and let's talk about your first nightmare case that you had and what happened.
Well, in thinking about this, I realized that the absolute probably worst nightmare cases for me and for anyone are neonatal deaths or prenatal deaths, where a pregnancy doesn't go to term and a child doesn't make it, or there is a stillbirth. The absolute worst scenario next to that, of course, is the loss of a surrogate's life. I've been very fortunate in my career that has never happened on my watch, but I have friends and colleagues who are mental health professionals where it has occurred. And there are just no words. It is a tragedy all the way around, where someone is trying to do something wonderful for someone else.
Sure.
It's one of the reasons it's so important in that preliminary phase, not only with an agency, but also in the psychological assessment phase, that women really understand that there is risk involved, and that there's an expression that says pregnancy is not a benign condition. Luckily, it's rare, but I would have to say those are the worst case scenarios. In the case of a prenatal death and early delivery and a baby doesn't make it, or probably more commonly is a very early delivery and the baby is in the NICU for a long time and may or may not have lingering issues throughout. And in that case, of course, we're needing to provide so much support to the surrogate who, in my experience, in almost every case, just has unbelievable guilt, even though she may have done everything right and not done anything to cause this to happen. It's not always true, but it's almost always true. That there's just no way, since the baby is in her body, that she does not feel somehow responsible. It's very challenging to deal with. So psychological intervention is crucial, in addition to, of course, the agency's support. I know they're great about sending gifts and providing actual support to her. But grief and loss is like this invisible loss. It's this invisible thing that not everybody understands. And being able to actively grieve is so important to a woman who's had that baby in her body for a period of time. And it's challenging because other people may be saying, well, it wasn't your baby anyway, that kind of thing, which is so incredibly dismissive and negating. So I would say that's at the top of the list. And, down from there, I won't say they're nightmare cases, but any pregnancy loss at any stage, even early, I find that surrogates inevitably feel guilty. And they know intellectually, and they can tell you, I know it's not my fault. I know it can happen. I know it's common. But I just feel so terrible about it. So that requires a lot of support as well. I wouldn't say those are nightmare cases. They're just opportunities for us to be useful.
Yeah, for sure.
Some actual nightmare cases I thought I would share. When we do the psychological assessments for agencies, we don't always know what happened after we did that. We're not always privy to, were they accepted into the program? Did they move forward? Or was our recommendation heeded and maybe they were told that they weren't appropriate? But some of them in the assessment phase really involve partners. So maybe an assessment is done with a surrogate and she seems like she's a really great candidate. But a thorough assessment will also involve her partner. And sometimes when that's done, it's determined that the partner has issues that would really make it so that this family is not recommended to carry a child for someone else. So some examples of that is doing an evaluation with a surrogate. She seems great. She seems like she'd be an appropriate candidate. And then there's a testing and evaluation of her husband who determines that he smokes pot regularly and marijuana is illegal in the state that they live in. He already has one arrest. He also has an arrest for petty theft, but it was dismissed. And in his testing, it's determined that he's quite antisocial. He's reckless. These are the things that we can learn from testing that you can't always get in a conversation. He's impulsive. He's socially isolated. So there are a number of things that tell us how is that going to play out in a relationship with another family that may or may not be geographically close, but is it certainly can smack of instability in their relationship, in the family home. Undoubtedly, there are children in the home. And we always want to foster a healthy, positive relationship between intended parents and surrogate. And I'd like to talk a lot about that. And in some of these cases, the partners are not at all interested in having a relationship. And sometimes they'll feel like, well, I don't have to like them. I don't have to know who they are. I don't have to talk to them. But this really is a family affair. And if someone does have a partner, it really needs to be all for one and one for all. So that's a situation where we would not recommend not moving forward, but we really don't know what the agency decides at the end of the day because they might think she's great and they can just work with the rest of it. Another one is there was a situation where the baby was determined to have a birth defect during the pregnancy. And it was recommended that the baby have surgery, that the surrogate have surgery so the baby could have surgery to repair the birth defect. And her husband did not want her to have that surgery because it was an option to do the surgery after the baby was born. But it was better for the baby to have the surgery while in utero. So you can imagine this creates a huge conflict between intended parents and the surrogate, with the agency in the middle trying to negotiate all parties' wishes. but it creates tremendous conflict. The intended parents are always in a position where, of course, they want the surrogate to be okay, but they also want her to do her best, bring that child to a healthy, to start breathing air. So that actually is kind of a nightmare case. It's very difficult. Everyone's health is at risk in one form or another, and there's kind of no good solution.
Sure.
And that's one where possibly it could not have been predicted. Some of these other cases, I would definitely say we could have headed that off at the pass. But in that case, something like that can't really be predicted. We certainly talk about, as you know, termination issues are a huge part of every assessment, and having a good match with like-minded intended parents is crucial. But in this case, it's not even a termination, it's a surgery. But of course, for the baby to have surgery, the surrogate has to have surgery, and the partner was just very concerned about his wife having that surgery, which then put the baby at more risk.
Sure.
That's one we may not have been able to head off. And then there was one I was involved in not too long ago that was really interesting. There was a surrogate that I had history with because this was her fourth journey, and it was a sibling journey for one of prior three families. And she was a very busy mom of two, single, and going to school and working at the same time. So she was very busy, very high functioning, really bright. And because she was so smart, they did a single embryo transfer. She was not interested in carrying twins and everything that brought with her. And the embryo split. And so she had identical twins. And she was very angry. She was angry and upset about this occurring, even though it was there's no way to prevent it.
Right.
And for whatever reason, as time went on, it translated to her almost ghosting the agency and the intended parents. She did what she needed to do. She was, at the end of the day, she was responsible. But it was almost like to the letter of the contract.
Yeah.
So she would do what she needed to do in the contract, but she was just so mad that she didn't want anybody to bother her. She didn't want to do any extra or have any touchy-feely kind of relationship. And it all had a positive outcome. But it was so stressful. And these were people that had a pre-existing relationship because of the prior journey. So it was very challenging for everyone involved, all three parties, including the agency. And she just kind of couldn't break out of herself enough to continue anything other than she was sort of just the facts. Like she would say, I had the appointment and that's it, but there was no extra. Again, that really couldn't have been, I was going to say it couldn't have been predicted, but I will say that she was ambivalent about doing a fourth cycle because she was very busy and because she had had three already. So I think at the end of the day, she did actually say I should have quit while I was ahead. But luckily it had a positive outcome and she was okay and the babies were okay. But that was a difficult one.
That's a hard one.
I'm going to take a breath there, see if you have any questions about any of those.
Sure. Yeah. I think, as you're talking, I'm thinking about some of the ones that I've been involved in. And when you're talking about the partner and how important it is to do a thorough consultation and evaluation, are you also doing the PAI or MMPI on the partner as well?
So my colleague who actually teaches the PAI absolutely does.
Mm-hmm.
And it's varied. Unfortunately, there isn't consistency across mental health professionals. Some do not.
Right.
But some of these cases where the husband had a record and the PAI resulted in all this information was because she did test them. So unfortunately, there isn't consistency. I would, when I'm doing assessments, but not everybody does. And you wouldn't really know a lot of that because they can show up on camera and you can talk to them and they can say, yeah, it's fine if she wants to do this, right? Which is what we hear a lot. And you can do certainly a criminal background check on them and find out there was an arrest. But, sometimes people say to us, well, how do you know that? How did you get that information? And my response is always like, we're trained to ask people questions in a way that we get information that they're not necessarily going to tell the agency. So, yes, it's because they were tested that we learned that.
Yeah, and that's definitely not something that I believe the majority of mental health practitioners are doing, but I do think it's a good thing to do.
It takes more time. And that's one of the reasons. So, you get pushback from the surrogate and the partner, and he's not home and he's working and this and that. And, he's not the one carrying the baby. So you get pushback there. You get pushback from agencies sometimes who are like, we don't want to spend the extra money for that. It's not a lot more money, actually, just, to do the other test. So that's part of the reason is that there's pushback. But you can see that to do a thorough job, you've got to do it.
Yeah, I think it's important. One of the nightmare cases that I was involved in years ago as an agency owner was the surrogate. The psychological consultation evaluation is really the last step for a lot of agencies before they clear a surrogate to match with parents. And sometimes they even do it after the match. And, once you've gotten to this point, you feel pretty confident as an agency owner that this is going to be a great surrogate. Everything's going to work out great. Yeah. So we had a surrogate who everything went great with her screening, and she had the consultation with the therapist and her partner, and the report came back. Everything was great. And then about a week later, we get a frantic call from the surrogate saying that, and they had been married, I think, 10 years, something like that, that she has to stop the process. Her husband showed up late last night, totally high on drugs, which he'd never done before in his life that she knew of, trying to break the windows in the house, all this crazy stuff. And it turned out that he had been hiding a drug problem for a year from her and everybody. And she ended up divorcing him and going through this whole process. And the happy thing is that she came back about 2 years later after the divorce and lots of therapy and stabilizing her life. And she came back and actually did a journey with us. But it was just an example that even the professionals sometimes can't catch everything, right? If someone's really good at hiding something, the best shot we have, right, is mental health evaluation. But you can't account for the fact that these are humans at the end of the day, and human behavior is unpredictable. And so that was definitely a nightmare that nobody saw coming. And thankfully, she hadn't been matched yet. But it can happen, right?
It can happen, and we're not fortune tellers,
right?
But we do have good tools at our disposal, and we do catch a lot. But you're absolutely right, and it is particularly frustrating, I will say, when we're asked to evaluate someone who's been matched and working with an agency that only does the assessment, the psychological assessment after the match. And I
Mm-hmm.
understand there are, financial reasons for doing that. But it makes our job much more challenging in many ways, because if we need to recommend her not moving forward,
Mm-hmm.
um, we usually hear something like, "Oh, but they already love her, and we
Yeah.
love her."
Yeah.
Um, and uh, and the information that we may have gleaned and the reasons we have for not recommending her kind of take a back seat
Mm-hmm.
to the fact
Mm-hmm.
that it's such a great match and they're crazy about her. But maybe they wouldn't be so crazy about her if they knew that she had postpartum depression for 2 years after her last birth, or that she's
Mm-hmm.
on medication for different things, or, there's a lot they don't know when the match is made. So it does
Right.
make it much more challenging. And ideally, if we could create the ideal program, every
Right.
candidate that makes it to a certain limited point with an agency would have a psychological assessment before going forward.
I 100% agree. And in my practice now, I do not match until with intended parents until there's a psychological evaluation done. I will say in that previous nightmare case, it would have been great had the husband also had a
Right.
MMPI or PAI done, because
Yeah.
then maybe we could
Yeah.
have caught
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. It's very
Um,
possible that something would have been caught to indicate
yeah.
it. But you're certainly right that it's not a perfect system. There is no perfect
Mhm.
system, but we catch a lot.
You do. And m- another one that I've had I think of the psychological evaluation as like what's the word I'm looking for? Like a safety net for us as agencies and professionals, because we can only do so much. We can only screen so far. And we had a candidate recently who was great. Everything was going well. Screening came back great. And then, and we're pretty thorough. Like, I've been doing this a long time and I ask a lot of questions, and we do a lot of digging behind the scenes to uncover anything that there might be. And we can spot red flags a mile away at this point. And nothing came up for her. And then we got to the psych and got the report back, and there was mention of suicide attempts just a few years prior. And that had
Oh,
not been brought up at all, ever. No mention whatsoever. And it is a question on our application for sure.
hmm.
And she'd actually been hospitalized for it. And we had no idea. And there was no way we would have known that because she didn't reveal it on the application. And so obviously she was disqualified. But had we not had the psychological evaluation or heeded it,
Right.
we could have been in
Right.
a very difficult situation if the surrogate had gone on to become pregnant and then something triggered her while
Yeah.
pregnant. That would have been
Yes, and that
horrible.
really points up what I said at the beginning of our chat, which is that this is for everyone's protection.
Mhm.
And we want, at the end of the day, we want everyone to not only be whole, but even greater than whole.
Right.
Um, and and I think what a lot of, and you would know this even better than I, but I find that a lot of women who are interested in being surrogates really don't understand how unbelievably stressful the process can be.
Mhm.
It can also be enriching and rewarding and fabulous and life-changing in a million ways. But it's
Mhm.
very stressful. The medical appointments, the disruption to your life schedule, the disruption
Mhm.
to your children's lives, the fact that your life is really not your own for, call it minimum, a year and a half by the time
Right.
you get pregnant, deliver, um, cycles that don't work for, embryo transfers that don't result in pregnancies,
Mhm.
um, limitation on travel,
Yes.
limitation on what you can eat. So it can be very stressful. And if that woman that you're talking about had had an early loss or a later loss that
Right.
triggered a depression, it would have been just tragic for her. So
Yeah.
it's really to
Yeah.
protect everyone. That's really
Absolutely.
scary.
Definitely.
You must
It's
have
really
just been
scary.
blown away. Like, Oh, how did they catch
Completely,
that?
completely blown away, completely shocked, and just scared at what could have happened had we not, caught that. That's my biggest fear is not catching something that should have been caught in screening and then going on to have that become a complicated issue or dangerous issue for her family, the baby, the parents, all the things. Is never a situation we want. And, I've heard of situations where agencies will have a surrogate fail the psych, and so then they'll just go to another thaerapist and try again until they get her cleared. And that is one of the most irresponsible and dangerous things I can think of. And thankfully, it's, a very small percentage of professionals that I have heard of doing this, but that is definitely one of the most dangerous things, I think. And that could create so many nightmare cases if she fails psych, as you say. However you want to say it. If she doesn't pass, if she's not cleared by the mental health therapist, that is
not an
hard
appropriate candidate.
Not an appropriate candidate, according to one mental health therapist, then that's the end of the road.
But you never want to tell somebody who wants to do this great thing, you didn't pass psych, which, in anybody's lay translation means you're crazy and they said you can't do this. And that's not the case. You really cannot fail psych. But we can certainly learn things in psych that might make us recommend that this might not be the great path for you.
Right. And I think that's a good point, is it's almost never about, is she psychologically sound? Because in my experience, 99% or, 95% of candidates are psychologically fine. It's that the dynamics of maybe her marriage or her family demands or whatever it is, there's some dynamic there that's not necessarily her psychological well-being or health. It's a dynamic that comes out during the evaluation that is not suitable for surrogacy. And so I do think that there's some validity in looking at it that way, is understanding that doesn't mean you're crazy. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your psychological health.
Yeah.
It's just that
it doesn't mean you're not a great person.
Right. Absolutely. Your heart's in the right place. You're a good person, but this is not a good time in your life. The dynamics are such that it's just not healthy to move forward.
Yes, exactly. It's interesting, too, because when I look on some of the agency websites or social media or whatever, there's often a list of, like, what makes who is a good candidate for surrogacy? Mm-hmm. And it'll have the list of, clearly, you need to have given birth to a live, healthy child, raising that child, be in a stable relationship or a stable home life is almost always on that list. And then, and then they get all the way through your screening process and they get with us and we discover something like, her partner is smoking pot in the house every day. And they might not consider that not stable, but we would. Anything that puts everybody at risk. Or even a partner, or even the candidate herself who may feel like, everything is stable, but maybe she's very isolated or has difficulty connecting with people. She has a good heart, but she doesn't think she can have a relationship with intended parents. She just wants to do this. It all goes into kind of determining what's going to be a great situation for all concerned, including the children that are born through surrogacy, who in the best case scenarios should ultimately have an opportunity to know the person who grew them for a year's time and took care of them for a year before they were able to go home to their parents. And if the relationship ends up such that that person's not available, I always tell surrogates, like, the baby you grow and help to bring into the world is living in your home for almost a year's time. They're hearing your voices. They're hearing the voice of your children. They're hearing the music you play. They're eating the food that you eat. And that all counts. And so when they, are developing and growing, for them to have a connection to, oh, that's where I lived for a year. I lived in that house with those people, is a way of kind of completing the circle and helping children to understand their origins. Their origin didn't start the minute they breathed air.
Right. That's right. 100%. And as a mom via a child conceived via sperm donation and as a gestational surrogate, I fully believe that every child deserves to be able to reconnect with their donor, carrier, what have you, in order to complete that circle for themselves. So I think that is a huge piece of the pie that we have to think about is this going to be someone who can maintain a relationship and stay in connection and be available and show up, right?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely.
Well, this has just been such a great conversation, and I so
scary
appreciate
though,
your
right? Scary stuff.
It is, but you know what? It's okay. A little bit of fear makes us stay on our toes and remember that this is an important process that we're all working towards. So I appreciate your expertise and your time. Thank you for being with us.
Anytime,
so that
Carrie.
brings us, thank you. That brings us to the end of this episode of the Normalized Surrogacy Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Carrie Flamer Powell. Want to thank my special guest again, Carole, for joining me for this chat today. You can learn more about Carole via the links in this podcast. Be sure to check us out online at surrogacymentor.com. Take our easy 2-minute quiz to see if you could be a surrogate. Thanks, and talk to you next time.